Lonely Cowboy hadn't seen anyone in 20 years until 300 Apaches appeared at his gate. You're about to discover one of the most incredible stories of survival, solitude, and unexpected redemption from the American frontier. A tale that will show you how a man who had completely isolated himself from humanity for 2 decades suddenly found himself face to face with 300 Apache warriors at his remote ranch gate. If you're ready to witness this extraordinary story of how the deepest loneliness can be transformed into the most profound connection, make sure to smash that like button right now, subscribe to our channel for more amazing frontier stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss these incredible tales from the untamed West. Now, let's journey back to 1889 in the remote wilderness of New Mexico Territory, where Zeke Morrison was about to have an encounter that would change everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the power of human connection. The relentless New Mexico sun beat down on the weathered wooden fence posts that marked the boundaries of what had once been known as the Broken Arrow Ranch, though no one had called it by that name for nearly 20 years. The vast expanse of high desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional mesa or canyon that carved dramatic shadows across the landscape during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. This was a land that demanded everything from those who dared to make their home here, and it had claimed more dreams than it had fulfilled during the decades of westward expansion. Ezekiel Morrison stood on the sagging porch of his cabin, a structure that had been built to house a family but now sheltered only one man and his memories. At 58 years old, Zeke's once powerful frame had been weathered by isolation and hardship into something resembling a scarecrow more than the prosperous rancher he had once been. His hair, now completely grey and reaching nearly to his shoulders, was held back with a piece of rawhide, and his beard covered most of his face in a tangled mass that hadn't seen scissors in over a decade. The silence that surrounded Zeke was not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning, but rather the profound, almost oppressive silence of complete solitude. It was a silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead, and occasionally the sound of his own voice, hoarse from disuse, as he spoke to the horses and cattle that comprised his only companions in this self-imposed exile from humanity. 20 years earlier, in 1869, the Broken Arrow Ranch had been home to Zeke Morrison, his beloved wife, Elena, and their 3 children, Margaret, age 12, Samuel, age 10, and little Rebecca, who had just celebrated her 6th birthday. The ranch had been thriving with over 2,000 head of cattle, a dozen hired hands, and plans for expansion that would have made it one of the largest operations in the territory. Zeke had been a man of vision and ambition, respected by his neighbors, and admired for his ability to make the harsh desert bloom with prosperity. But prosperity and happiness can be fragile things on the frontier, where disease, violence, and the unforgiving nature of the land itself could destroy a lifetime of work in a matter of days. For the Morrison family, that destruction came in the form of a cholera outbreak that swept through the region during the summer of 1869, claiming victims with ruthless efficiency and leaving devastation in its wake. Zeke had watched helplessly as the disease took his family one by one. First, little Rebecca, whose fever burned so high that she seemed to glow in the darkness of their bedroom. Then Samuel, who fought the sickness with the same determination he brought to everything else, but ultimately succumbed after a week of suffering. Margaret lasted longest, caring for her mother even as she grew weaker herself, until finally both she and Elena died within hours of each other on a sweltering August night that remained burned into Zeke's memory like a brand. In the space of 3 weeks, Ezekiel Morrison had gone from being a successful rancher with a loving family to a broken man standing alone beside 4 freshly dug graves on a hill overlooking his ranch. The hired hands had fled at the first sign of the disease, taking whatever they could carry and leaving behind only empty bunkhouses and the echo of their horses' hoofbeats as they rode toward what they hoped would be safety in more populated areas. The logical thing to do would have been to sell the ranch and start over somewhere else, perhaps return to the east where Zeke had been born and raised before the lure of the frontier had drawn him west. Many men in his situation had done exactly that, accepting their losses and seeking new opportunities where the memories weren't so painful and the possibilities seemed less overwhelming. But Zeke Morrison was not a logical man in the months following his family's death. He was a man consumed by grief and guilt, tormented by the belief that he should have been able to protect them, that his ambition and pride had brought them to this remote place where help was too far away and the dangers too numerous to count. The thought of leaving the place where they were buried, of abandoning the home they had built together, was more than he could bear. So instead of leaving, Zeke had made a different choice. He had dismissed the few remaining ranch hands, sold off most of the cattle, and begun the gradual process of withdrawing from the world entirely. He stopped going to town for supplies, instead learning to make do with what he could grow, hunt, or craft with his own hands. He avoided contact with neighbors and travelers, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense when others were approaching his property so that he could disappear into the canyons and caves that honeycombed the surrounding landscape. As the years passed, Ezekiel Morrison became something of a legend among the few people who remembered the Broken Arrow Ranch and its former owner. Some claimed he had died years ago and that his ghost still haunted the property. Others insisted they had caught glimpses of a wild man living like a hermit in the desert, more animal than human after so many years of solitude. The truth, as is often the case with legends, was both simpler and more complex than any of the stories that grew up around his absence. The truth was that Zeke had survived, but at a cost that went far beyond the material losses he had suffered. He had become a man haunted not only by grief, but by the gradual erosion of his own humanity as the years of isolation took their toll. He spoke to his animals as if they were people, carried on long conversations with the photographs of his family that he had carefully preserved in the cabin, and sometimes found himself unsure whether events had actually happened or were products of his increasingly troubled mind. The ranch itself had fallen into disrepair, though Zeke maintained just enough of it to meet his basic needs for survival. The fences were patched with whatever materials he could find, the buildings were weathered and worn but still functional, and he kept a small herd of cattle and horses that provided him with milk, occasional meat, and the companionship that prevented him from slipping entirely into madness. On this particular morning in late September 1889, Zeke was engaged in the routine that had structured his days for the past 2 decades. He rose before dawn, fed and watered his animals, checked the perimeter of his property for signs of predators or other threats, and then spent the daylight hours working on whatever projects needed attention. Today, that meant repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent windstorm, solitary work that allowed his mind to wander along the familiar paths of memory and regret. As he worked, Zeke found himself thinking about Eleanor and how she had always insisted that their isolation was temporary, that eventually they would need to reconnect with the larger community for the sake of their children's education and social development. She had been right, of course, but her wisdom had come too late to save any of them from the disease that had ultimately claimed their lives. Elena always said we couldn't live out here forever by ourselves, Zeke muttered to the fence post he was wrestling into position, his voice cracked and rough from lack of use. Said the children needed to be around other people, needed to learn how to be part of something bigger than just our little family. And the irony of his current situation was not lost on him. He had indeed learned to live by himself, but it had cost him everything that had once made life worth living. The skills of self-sufficiency that had served him well as a rancher had become the tools of his own imprisonment in a world that had grown smaller with each passing year. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build toward what promised to be another scorching day, Zeke paused in his work to wipe the sweat from his forehead and scan the horizon with the automatic vigilance that had become second nature during his years of solitude. The landscape shimmered in the heat, creating the optical illusions that were common in this part of the country. But something about the movement he detected in the distance seemed different from the usual mirages and dust devils. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a dark line wavering on the horizon, perhaps a cloud shadow or the visual distortion caused by hot air rising from the sun-baked earth. But as Zeke watched with growing attention, the dark line began to resolve itself into something more substantial and concerning. It was moving toward his ranch with the steady, purposeful pace of a large group of riders. Zeke's first instinct was to retreat to one of the hiding places he had established over the years, caves and gullies where he could observe approaching visitors without being detected himself. This had been his standard response to the occasional travelers who had ventured onto his property during the past 2 decades, and it had served him well in maintaining his isolation from the outside world. But something about this approaching group was different from the usual lone prospectors or small parties of settlers who sometimes passed through the area. The number of riders was far larger than anything he had encountered before, and their formation suggested organization and purpose rather than casual travel. As they drew closer, Zeke could make out individual figures and horses, and his estimation of their numbers continued to climb with each passing minute. By the time the group had reached the outer boundaries of what had once been the Broken Arrow Ranch, Zeke could see that his property was about to be visited by what appeared to be several hundred Native American warriors, their horses kicking up a dust cloud that could be seen for miles in every direction. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a reminder of the power and presence of the original inhabitants of this land who had been largely displaced by the expansion of white settlement, but who clearly maintained their own communities and ways of life. Zeke's knowledge of local Native American tribes was limited by his years of isolation, but he recognized enough of what he saw to identify the approaching group as Apache, based on their distinctive clothing, weapons, and the way they sat their horses. The Apache had a reputation as fierce warriors and skilled survivors who had resisted the encroachment of white settlers with determination and tactical brilliance, making them both respected and feared throughout the territory. The practical implications of having 300 Apache warriors approaching his remote ranch were staggering to contemplate. Zeke had no means of defending his property against such a force, no way to call for help even if he had wanted to, and no recent experience in dealing with other human beings, let alone representatives of a culture that he understood only through rumors and second-hand stories. As the Apache riders reached the entrance to his property, marked by a weathered wooden gate that hung at an angle from posts that had shifted over the years, they came to a halt in a formation that demonstrated both military discipline and ceremonial significance. The warriors arranged themselves in several ranks, with their leaders positioned at the front, and their pack animals and supplies organized behind them in an orderly fashion that spoke of extensive travel and careful planning. For several long minutes, both Zeke and the Apache force simply observed each other across the distance that separated the ranch house from the gate. Zeke remained on his porch, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement that he hadn't felt in 20 years, while the Apache leaders appeared to be discussing their next course of action with the calm deliberation of experienced negotiators. Finally, one of the Apache leaders rode forward alone, stopping halfway between his companions and the ranch house, in a gesture that indicated his peaceful intentions, while also demonstrating his courage and authority. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with long black hair streaked with gray, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. His clothing was a mixture of traditional Apache elements and practical items that reflected the complex realities of Native American life in the changing West. The Apache leader raised his hand in what Zeke recognized as a universal gesture of peaceful greeting, then called out in clear, accented English, "White man, we come in peace to speak with the hermit of the Broken Arrow. We have traveled many days to reach this place, and we request permission to approach your home." Zeke felt a shock of recognition at hearing his ranch's former name spoken aloud for the first time in decades. The fact that these Apache knew about the Broken Arrow Ranch and had apparently come here specifically to find him suggested a level of knowledge about his situation that was both surprising and unsettling. How had they learned about his existence, and what did they want from a man who had spent 20 years avoiding all human contact? Despite his apprehension, Zeke found himself responding to the Apache leader's polite and respectful approach. After so many years of silence, the sound of his own voice seemed strange and unfamiliar as he called back, "You are welcome to approach, but I should warn you that I have little to offer in the way of hospitality. I have been alone here for many years and am not accustomed to receiving visitors." The Apache leader smiled at this response, an expression that seemed to combine understanding with something that might have been compassion. He dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the porch, his movements careful and deliberate to avoid creating any impression of threat or aggression. "My name is Standing Bear," the Apache said as he approached within normal conversational distance. "I am a chief of the Chiricahua Apache, and these are my people. We know of your story, Hermit of the Broken Arrow, and we have come to offer you something that you may not have realized you were missing." Zeke studied the Apache chief's face, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the sincerity in his expression. After 2 decades of avoiding human contact, he found himself surprisingly eager to engage in conversation, even with a stranger who represented a culture he knew little about. "What story do you think you know about me?" Zeke asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "And what could you possibly offer to a man who has chosen to live apart from the world?" Standing Bear's expression grew more serious as he considered his response. "We know that you were once Ezekiel Morrison, owner of the Broken Arrow Ranch. We know that you lost your family to the white man's disease and that you have lived alone ever since, avoiding all contact with your own people and with ours. We know that you have become like a ghost, existing but not truly living." The accuracy of Standing Bear's knowledge was startling, but even more surprising was the lack of judgment or condemnation in his voice. Many people who knew Zeke's story viewed his self-imposed isolation as cowardice or madness, but the Apache chief seemed to understand it as a response to profound grief and trauma. "How do you know these things?" Zeke asked, genuinely puzzled by the extent of the Apache's information about his personal history. "The land remembers everything, and the people who live closest to the land remember longest," Standing Bear replied. "Your story has been told around Apache campfires for 20 years, not as something to mock or condemn, but as an example of how great loss can drive even the strongest men to seek solitude and silence." Standing Bear paused, then continued with evident compassion in his voice. "But we have also come to understand that 20 years is long enough for any man to carry such grief alone. The time has come for you to rejoin the world of the living, and we are here to help you do that." This statement was so unexpected and so directly challenging to everything Zeke had built his life around for the past 2 decades that he found himself speechless for several moments. The idea that these Apache strangers would concern themselves with his welfare was difficult to comprehend, and their suggestion that he should abandon his solitary existence seemed to ignore the very real reasons why he had chosen isolation in the first place. "I appreciate your concern," Zeke finally managed to say, "but I'm not sure you understand the situation. I chose this life because I couldn't bear to be around other people after what happened to my family. The grief and the guilt were too much to carry in the company of others who couldn't possibly understand what I had lost." Standing Bear nodded with the patience of someone who had dealt with grief and loss in his own life and community. "We understand more than you might think, Ezekiel Morrison. The Apache people have also suffered great losses to disease, to war, to the changes that have come to this land. Many of our people have known the temptation to withdraw from life when the pain becomes too great to bear." The Apache chief gestured toward his companions, who remained mounted and respectfully distant, but clearly attentive to the conversation taking place. "But we have learned something that you may not have discovered in your years of solitude. Grief shared is grief diminished, and healing comes not from avoiding the company of others, but from finding the right companions who can understand and honor our losses." As if summoned by Standing Bear's gesture, several other Apache leaders dismounted and approached the porch, their expressions grave but friendly as they prepared to join the conversation. Zeke could see that this was not a casual encounter, but rather a carefully planned intervention by people who had given considerable thought to what they hoped to accomplish. One of the newly arrived Apache was an elderly woman whose weathered face and silver hair spoke of many years of experience and wisdom. She carried herself with the dignity and authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of cultural knowledge and maternal concern. "I am Singing Woman," she said in slightly accented English, "and I have come to speak woman's truth to man's stubbornness. Your wife would not want you to waste 20 years of life in mourning for her and your children. She would want you to honor their memory by living fully and finding ways to help others who suffer as you have suffered." The mention of Elena hit Zeke like a physical blow, stirring up emotions and memories that he had spent 20 years trying to bury beneath routine and isolation. How could this Apache woman, who had never known his family, speak with such certainty about what Elena would have wanted? And yet, as he considered her words, Zeke had to admit that they rang true to everything he had known about his wife's character and values. Elena had been a woman who believed in community, in helping others, and in finding meaning through service and connection. She would indeed have been horrified to learn that her husband had spent 2 decades hiding from the world instead of finding ways to honor her memory through positive action. Another Apache leader, a man of perhaps 40 years with the bearing of a respected warrior and counselor, stepped forward to add his voice to the conversation. "I am Grey Wolf, and I speak for the young men who have known loss but have chosen to continue fighting for their people and their future. Your isolation has protected you from further pain, but it has also prevented you from discovering the strength that comes from standing with others who share your struggles." As the afternoon wore on, more Apache leaders joined the conversation, each bringing their own perspective on loss, grief, and the path to healing. Zeke found himself drawn into discussions that challenged every assumption he had made about his life during the past 20 years, forcing him to consider possibilities that he had long ago dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. The Apache had clearly given considerable thought to this encounter, and their arguments were both practical and philosophical. They spoke of the waste represented by his unused skills and knowledge, of the potential contributions he could make to their community or to other white settlements that struggled with the challenges of frontier life. They also spoke of the spiritual dimensions of grief and the ways that honoring the dead could become a path to serving the living. But perhaps most powerfully, they spoke of their own experiences with loss and survival, sharing stories that demonstrated their deep understanding of the kind of pain that had driven Zeke into solitude. These were not people offering easy answers or superficial comfort, but rather individuals who had faced their own dark nights of the soul and had found ways to emerge from them stronger and more compassionate. As the sun began to set and the harsh heat of the day gave way to the more comfortable temperatures of evening, Standing Bear made a proposal that stunned Zeke with its generosity and implications. Ezekiel Morrison, we invite you to come with us to our winter camp in the mountains. Live with us for one season, learn our ways of dealing with grief and loss, and see if the company of others who understand suffering can help you find a path back to life. The offer was extraordinary for multiple reasons. The Apache were not known for casually inviting white men into their communities, particularly during a period when tensions between Native Americans and settlers remained high throughout the territory. For them to extend such an invitation to a hermit they barely knew suggested either remarkable generosity or a deeper purpose that Zeke had not yet grasped. "Why would you do this?" Zeke asked, genuinely mystified by their interest in his welfare. "What could you possibly gain by taking in a broken-down hermit who hasn't been fit company for man or beast in 20 years? Singing Woman smiled at this question, her weathered face creasing with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Because healing one person helps to heal the world, and because the skills and knowledge you have gained in 20 years of survival could benefit our people in ways you cannot imagine. But most importantly, because no one should have to carry such grief alone when there are others willing to share the burden." The conversation continued well into the evening, with the Apache making their camp near Zeke's property and sharing food and stories around fires that provided light and warmth against the desert cold. For the first time in 20 years, Zeke found himself part of a community, even temporarily, and he was surprised to discover how much he had missed the simple pleasures of human conversation and companionship. The Apache had brought supplies for an extended stay, suggesting that they were prepared to spend as much time as necessary to accomplish their mission. They shared their food generously, including Zeke in their meals, and treating him with the respect due to a potential member of their community rather than as an outsider or curiosity. As the night progressed, individual Apache approached Zeke with their own stories of loss and recovery. Warriors spoke of battles lost and comrades killed, women told of children taken by disease or accident, and elders shared the wisdom they had gained through decades of surviving in a world that often seemed designed to break the human spirit. One particularly moving conversation took place with a young Apache man named Swift Runner, who had lost his wife and infant son in a cavalry attack on their village 3 years earlier. Like Zeke, he had initially responded to his loss by withdrawing from his community and seeking solitude in the mountains, where he had spent months living like a wild animal and contemplating ending his own life. "I thought that my pain was unique, that no one else could understand what I was feeling," Swift Runner told Zeke as they sat by one of the campfires. "I believed that staying away from my people was the only way to protect them from my anger and despair. But isolation only made the pain stronger, like poison that grows more deadly when it cannot be released from the body." Swift Runner went on to describe how other members of his band had refused to accept his withdrawal, persistently seeking him out and gradually drawing him back into the community through patience, understanding, and the gradual assumption of responsibilities that gave his life new meaning and purpose. "The healing did not come quickly or easily," Swift Runner continued, "but it came because others refused to let me disappear into my grief. They showed me that my wife and son were honored not by my suffering, but by my continued living, and by the ways I could help ensure that other families did not suffer as mine had suffered." As Zeke listened to these stories, he began to understand that his situation was not as unique as he had believed. The Apache community included many individuals who had faced losses similar to his own, and their survival had depended not on isolation, but on their ability to find support and purpose within their larger community. But the most profound conversation of the evening took place with Standing Bear himself, as the two men walked away from the fires to a place where they could speak privately about the deeper purposes behind this unprecedented gathering. "Ezekiel Morrison," Standing Bear said, as they stood beneath the star-filled desert sky, "there is something I must tell you that may help you understand why we have come so far to reach you. Your story has become part of our oral tradition, passed down through the years not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how even the strongest people can be broken by loss. Standing Bear paused to gaze up at the stars, then continued with evident emotion in his voice. But recently, our medicine people have spoken of visions in which the hermit of the broken arrow plays an important role in the survival of our people during the difficult times that lie ahead. They have seen you as a bridge between our worlds, someone who understands both the white man's ways and the pain of those who have lost everything to the changes sweeping across this land. This revelation added an entirely new dimension to Zeke's understanding of the Apache visit. They had not come simply out of charitable concern for his welfare, but because they believed he might have a role to play in their own survival and future. The weight of this responsibility was both humbling and terrifying for a man who had spent 20 years avoiding all human contact. "I don't understand," Zeke said honestly. "What could I possibly do to help your people? I'm a hermit who can barely take care of himself, let alone contribute to anyone else's welfare." Standing Bear smiled at this response, recognizing the humility that had always been part of Zeke's character even during his years of isolation. "You understand survival in this harsh land better than almost anyone alive. You have learned to live with minimal resources, to read the signs of weather and wildlife, to make do with what the desert provides. These skills could be invaluable to my people as we face an uncertain future." The Apache chief went on to explain that his band was part of a larger group of Native Americans who were seeking ways to maintain their traditional lifestyle while adapting to the realities of an increasingly settled and regulated territory. The knowledge of sustainable living that Zeke had developed during his 20 years of solitude could help them establish communities that were both economically viable and culturally authentic. "But more than your practical skills," Standing Bear continued, "we need your understanding of loss and recovery. Many of our young people struggle with despair as they see their traditional ways disappearing. Your example of survival against overwhelming odds could inspire them to find their own paths through darkness." As the night wore on, Zeke found himself seriously considering the Apache invitation for the first time. The idea of abandoning his solitary existence was terrifying, but it was also oddly appealing after so many years of emptiness and routine. The prospect of using his hard-won knowledge to help others survive and thrive gave him a sense of potential purpose that he hadn't felt since before his family's death. When dawn broke over the desert, painting the eastern sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Zeke made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Standing before the assembled Apache band, with Standing Bear and Singing Woman flanking him in positions of honor, he announced his intention to accept their invitation and accompany them to their winter camp. "I have been dead to the world for 20 years, Zeke said, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been in decades. "Maybe it's time to see if I can learn to live again among people who understand what it means to lose everything and still find reasons to continue." The Apache responded to his decision with a ceremony that honored both his choice and the significance of the moment. Singing Woman presented him with traditional clothing that would mark him as a respected member of their community, while Standing Bear spoke words of welcome that formally inducted him into their band as a brother and advisor. The process of preparing to leave the Broken Arrow Ranch was both practical and emotional for Zeke. He had to decide which of his possessions were worth taking and which would be left behind, a process that forced him to confront the material remnants of his 20 years of isolation. More importantly, he had to visit the graves of his family and find a way to explain to them why he was finally ready to leave the place where they were buried. Standing at the graveside on the hill overlooking his property, Zeke spoke aloud to Elena and his children for the first time in years. "I know you've been waiting for me to stop hiding from life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that honoring your memory doesn't mean dying with you. I'm going to try to find ways to help other people, the way you always wanted me to do." As he prepared to mount the horse that the Apache had provided for his journey, Zeke took one last look at the ranch that had been both his home and his prison for 2 decades. The buildings looked smaller and shabbier than he remembered. The fences were patched and crooked, and the whole property had the air of abandonment that comes when people stop believing in the future. But he also saw the graves on the hill, still carefully tended after all these years, and the evidence of his own stubborn survival in the face of overwhelming grief. The Broken Arrow Ranch had served its purpose as a place of refuge and gradual healing, even if that healing had taken much longer than anyone might have expected. The journey to the Apache winter camp took nearly 2 weeks, traversing some of the most spectacular and challenging terrain in the American Southwest. For Zeke, who had rarely traveled more than a few miles from his ranch during the past 20 years, the experience was both exhausting and exhilarating. He rediscovered his appreciation for the raw beauty of the desert landscape, the intricate relationships between plants and animals that made survival possible in such a harsh environment, and the deep satisfaction that comes from traveling with companions who share both the hardships and the rewards of the journey. During the travel, Zeke began to learn about Apache culture and society in ways that challenged many of his preconceptions about Native American life. He discovered that the Apache were not the savage warriors of popular imagination, but rather a sophisticated people with complex social structures, rich spiritual traditions, and practical knowledge of desert survival that far exceeded his own hard-won expertise. The Apache winter camp was located in a protected valley high in the mountains, where natural springs provided year-round water and the elevation offered relief from the intense heat of the lower desert. The camp itself was a masterpiece of practical organization, with family groups arranged according to clan relationships and common areas designated for cooking, crafts, and community gatherings. Zeke was provided with his own lodge, positioned in a location that honored his status as a respected guest, while also allowing him privacy when he needed time alone to process his experiences. The lodge was comfortable and well-appointed, furnished with blankets, cooking utensils, and other necessities that demonstrated the Apache commitment to ensuring his well-being during his stay. The process of integrating into Apache society was gradual and carefully managed by Standing Bear and other community leaders who understood the challenges faced by someone attempting to rejoin human society after 20 years of isolation. Zeke was given responsibilities that matched his abilities and interests, starting with tasks related to animal care and gradually expanding to include teaching Apache young people about ranching techniques and sustainable land use. One of Zeke's most significant contributions came in the area of water management and conservation. His years of solitary survival had taught him techniques for finding, storing, and conserving water that proved invaluable to the Apache community. He designed and helped build improved irrigation systems for their gardens, developed methods for capturing and storing rainwater, and shared knowledge about reading natural signs that indicated the presence of underground springs. But perhaps more importantly, Zeke found himself serving as a counselor and mentor to Apache individuals who were struggling with their own experiences of loss and despair. His story of survival against overwhelming odds and his gradual journey back from the brink of total withdrawal from life provided inspiration and practical guidance to others who faced similar challenges. One of the most rewarding relationships Zeke developed was with a young Apache woman named Morning Star, whose husband had been killed in a conflict with cavalry soldiers the previous year. Like Zeke, she had responded to her loss by withdrawing from her community and avoiding the activities that had previously given her life meaning and purpose. Through patient conversation and shared work on practical projects, Zeke was able to help Morningstar understand that her grief was a natural response to profound loss, but that it need not define the rest of her life. He shared techniques for managing the overwhelming emotions that came in waves, strategies for finding meaning in daily activities, and most importantly, the understanding that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. The pain never completely goes away, Zeke told Morningstar during one of their conversations, but it changes from something that destroys you into something that connects you to others who have suffered similar losses. Your husband's memory is honored not by your suffering, but by the ways you use your experience to help others avoid or survive similar tragedies. As winter gave way to spring in the mountains, Zeke began to understand that his time with the Apache was approaching a transition point. He had gained enormously from his exposure to their ways of dealing with grief and loss, their approaches to community building and mutual support, and their sophisticated understanding of sustainable living in harmony with the natural environment. But he had also begun to envision ways that he could use what he had learned to benefit not only the Apache, but also other communities throughout the territory that faced similar challenges. The isolation and self-sufficiency skills he had developed during his 20 years as a hermit, combined with the community building and healing knowledge he had gained from the Apache, could make him uniquely valuable as a bridge between different groups seeking to survive and thrive in the changing West. When Zeke shared these thoughts with Standing Bear and the other Apache leaders, they expressed both understanding and support for his desire to expand his service beyond their immediate community. The vision that had originally brought them to his ranch was indeed being fulfilled, as Zeke had been transformed from a broken hermit into someone capable of serving as a connector and healer between different worlds. The decision about what to do next was made easier by the arrival of a delegation of white settlers from a struggling community in the valley below the mountains. They had heard about the presence of a white man in the Apache camp and had come to investigate whether he might be willing to help them address the severe problems they were facing with drought, crop failures, and conflicts with neighboring ranchers. The settlers' request provided Zeke with an opportunity to test his new understanding of community building and mutual support in a context that combined his old knowledge of white society with his new appreciation for Apache approaches to problem-solving and cooperation. After consultation with Standing Bear and other Apache leaders, it was decided that Zeke would spend part of his time working with the white settlers while maintaining his connections to the Apache community. This arrangement proved to be remarkably successful, as Zeke was able to serve as a translator not only of language, but of cultural approaches and values that could benefit both communities. He helped the white settlers learn Apache techniques for water conservation and drought-resistant agriculture, while also helping the Apache understand certain aspects of white society that could be useful in their own negotiations with territorial authorities. Over the following months, Zeke's reputation as a bridge builder and problem solver spread throughout the region, attracting requests for assistance from communities facing various challenges related to survival, cooperation, and conflict resolution. He found himself traveling frequently between different settlements, Native American camps, and ranching operations, always carrying messages of understanding and practical knowledge that could help people live more successfully in the challenging environment of the Southwest. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, as it required Zeke to operate in situations where cultural misunderstanding and historical grievances created potential for violence. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways that he had not experienced since before his family's death, providing him with a sense of purpose and meaning that made every day worth living. One particularly significant success came when Zeke was able to help negotiate a water rights agreement between a large cattle ranch and a Navajo community that had been engaged in an escalating conflict over access to a crucial water source. His understanding of both the practical and cultural dimensions of the dispute, combined with his reputation for fairness and his lack of personal investment in either side's victory, allowed him to craft a solution that met everyone's essential needs while establishing a framework for ongoing cooperation. As the years passed, Zeke's new life continued to evolve in ways that honored both his past experiences and his commitment to service. He never remarried or started a new family, but he found himself serving as a father figure and mentor to countless young people from various communities who sought his guidance and support. He also maintained his connection to the Broken Arrow Ranch, returning periodically to tend his family's graves and to maintain the property as a place of retreat and reflection. But the ranch was no longer a prison of grief and isolation. It had become instead a symbol of survival and transformation, a reminder that even the most profound losses can eventually become sources of strength and wisdom. The story of the lonely cowboy who had been rescued from 20 years of isolation by 300 Apache warriors became a legend throughout the Southwest, told and retold as an example of the power of compassion to transform individual lives and entire communities. At its heart remained the simple truth that Zeke had discovered during that first evening around the Apache campfires, that healing comes not from avoiding the company of others, but from finding the right companions who can understand and honor our losses while helping us discover new reasons to embrace life. Ezekiel Morrison lived for many more years, becoming one of the most respected peacemakers and mediators in the territory. When he finally died at the age of 78, representatives from dozens of different communities, both Native American and white, came to pay their respects at his funeral. He was buried beside his family on the hill overlooking the Broken Arrow Ranch, but his legacy lived on in the countless lives he had touched and the bridges he had built between different peoples seeking to share the vast landscape of the American West. The wooden marker placed at his grave bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of his remarkable journey. Ezekiel Morrison, 1831–1909. He learned that grief shared is grief diminished, and that healing comes to those who choose service over solitude. Usherdu, if this incredible story of transformation, healing, and the power of human connection has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched mine, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who need to be reminded that it's never too late to choose life over isolation, service over self-pity, and community over solitude. Subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from America's frontier and hit that notification bell so you never miss these tales of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit. Remember that each of us has the power to be like those Apache warriors who refused to let one man waste away in loneliness, choosing instead to offer the hand of friendship and the promise of purpose to someone who had forgotten how to hope. Until next time, may we all have the wisdom to recognize when someone needs rescuing from their own isolation and the courage to offer them a path back to the world of the living.